All right. So my name's Amos Farooqi. It's like 6:45 in the morning right now, so I'm still like waking up a bit. So please bear with me. But today I'll be presenting my publication, Regional Hip Hop in the Seoul Metropole, a case study of underground hip hop in Gwangju. And a little about myself. I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Copenhagen. Right now, just started. A lot of my research has been done on regional hip hop scenes and, kind of regional inequalities, this phenomenon of cultural deterritorialization and such. And yeah, my research and my PhD will kind of build on this and look at Korean hip hop as a whole and localism and the concept of place. So this study started, as many of you may know, hip hop has just blown up in Korea over the past couple of years. And a lot of scholarship on Korean hip hop has grown a lot as well. But a lot of it has been very Seoul centric, really centered on the scene as whole. So this publication is just a snapshot of hip hop scenes in regional cities, and just again focusing on the city of Gwangju in the southwest part of the country in Honam. And so let's start off with this. So media scholar Will Straw, in his research on music scenes in Austin in the early 1990s, mentioned how local music scenes play an instrumental role in the development of new sounds and genres within the wider commercial music industry. And so traditionally, artists that started to, become somewhat successful would kind of move to a center of musical agglomeration. So that would be, for the US, like move to New York or Los Angeles, where the music industry was based, or in the case of Korea, to Seoul. Now, this would, again, artists then would kind of be stuck in between, all right, do I stay in my hometown and kind of strengthen the scene here, or do I bring my music to a wider audience and move to larger city where the music industry is based? Now, this dynamic has really changed over the years thanks to, these revolutionary advances in music technology. So, we've had the, digital recording software, the MP3, YouTube, social media. It's really democratized the production, distribution, and consumption of music. And so artists, have now kind of declustered, and they don't have to move to these centers of musical agglomeration. And we see this phenomenon happening, worldwide, across the developed world. And you'll see these photos here, like on the top, what a studio back in the day would look like when you needed a highly trained audio technician and such, where below is one of the producers I interviewed on Syncable, his little studio in an office in Gwangju. And so I think, to kind of illustrate, I just want to illustrate, how this phenomenon through, looking at artists in other countries. And we see Slow Tie, he's from Northampton in the UK. And, these artists now, they can stay in their own localities, respective localities, their hometowns. And you see them kind of showing off their hometowns as well. And, Slow Tie in the video for Gorgeous, he's in Northampton. He's at the Northampton Town FC football ground in his Northampton shirt, rapping about his hometown. We see West Side Gun in Eurostep. He's out of Buffalo, New York. And he's got his Buffalo Bills hoodie on, if any of you are familiar with American football. And some of you might be familiar with Shooter Gang from Aarhus. I'm not going to pronounce the name of that song. Yeah. But you see them out on the streets of Aarhus in their AGF Aarhus track jackets, really, going and representing their city. And this is interesting. These are all, cities with less than 300,000 people, but they've been able to stay there, and they've been able to really build like a large profile, not just within their country, but, around the world. But, this sort of phenomenon hasn't reached Korea. And, there's a number of major hip hop artists that come from provincial cities. But again, as I mentioned earlier, little attention has really been paid to the scenes in these localities. And so, we see rappers like E-Sense is from Gyeongsang in Gyeongsangbuk-do. It's a satellite city of Daegu. Simon D, who's from Busan, and Ugly Duck, who I interviewed for this publication out of Gwangju. And all three of them are based in Seoul. comes to this, I mean, there's not a single major artist in the Korean hip hop scene based outside of Seoul. And regional hip hop scenes have very little profile within the Korean music industry. So why does this remain the case in Korean hip hop, you know, unlike other countries in the developed world? And so for this paper, I interviewed 12 artists, all of them kind of prominent members in the scene. Nearly all of them have ended up moving to Seoul. And I also conducted, my own observations, participated in the scene between 2016 and 2019. And, when I was interviewing these artists and, from my own observations, you see this dynamic where, there's a really lack of local support for these artists in Gwangju. And it kind of leads to this weakened local music infrastructure. And so they're forced to go to Seoul in search of opportunities and networking to build their profile in the scene. And, from my research, I started to notice this phenomenon of cultural deterritorialization in which, local culture and identity is displaced by, basically the cultural hegemony emanating from Seoul. And in Seoul, I mean, this is where politics, business, media, education is all centered to a very extreme extent. And so to kind of give some context to this, I mean, Korea has long been in, various regimes and various guises, a very highly centralized state. Its political and economic systems. And, the music industry has been no exception to this phenomenon. And so, as I was mentioning with musical agglomeration, I mean, this was a result of kind of two things. As Korean popular music emerged in the late 50s and the 1960s, really the participants, the people making music came from Seoul. I mean, that's where the highest average incomes were. And the people participating and making music, came from families with high incomes. They were university students, and they had the money to pursue these musical endeavors. On the other hand, on the darker side was the dictatorships of Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan had to keep subversive material off the airwaves. And so they really had to keep the media consolidated and, in check near their seat of power in Seoul. There's various incidents. I mean, Park Chung-hee arrested dozens of music artists in the 1970s. Chun Doo-hwan, I mean, he shut down all private media broadcasters and consolidated them into the two public broadcast stations, KBS and MBC. So after democratization, you do start to see these new music scenes form. Punk rock, indie, hip hop, they begin to emerge. But the type of oligopolistic concentration that really defined the Korean music industry under authoritarianism really remained intact and kind of evolved over time. And this goes to the policy set by former president, the late Kim Young-sam, the Segyehwa policy, which is kind of roughly translated as globalization, in 1995. So his policy really emphasized the need for internationally competitive Korean cultural industries. Him seeing just how lucrative cultural exports could be would, help his Korea transition to a post-industrial economy. And as Eun Jae-ryu and Dal Yong-jin said in their work, the Korean government now functions as a provider of legal, policy, and financial resources to the cultural industries. And it's not too far off from how Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan provided those types of resources to large industrial conglomerates, the chaebol, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So what ends up happening is you just have a handful of these large entertainment conglomerates dominating the music industry. And it's really in conjunction, Hallyu rises and K-pop rises that this is occurring. And you can see in this photo, Park Han-hye hanging out with all the K-pop stars. And this isn't to say that the government, some people have been saying, oh, well, the government's responsible for K-pop. This isn't to say the government started K-pop, but it's saying that there was definitely an environment that helped produce the large entertainment conglomerates. Of course, at the end of the day, these labels are producing these performers and such. Now, this dynamic is really changed in recent years, and it's, you know, a lot, hip hop has exploded in popularity. And so independent labels kind of outside this K-pop bubble have really, you know, enjoyed a lot of success. You know, labels like Biz Major, Highlight Records, AOMG. But when you kind of, you know, look at this, it's much of the success is owed to the television program Show Me the Money. If you're not familiar with Show Me the Money, it's a reality television program contest where all these rappers, you know, compete to win the competition and be crowned, and yeah, the winner, and become famous. And it's broadcast on Mnet, produced and broadcast on Mnet, which is a channel owned by CJ Entertainment, which is probably the largest entertainment conglomerate. You see that. So what we see happening is that, you know, the Korean hip hop scene is still beholden to the influence of, you know, these large Seoul-based entertainment conglomerates. And so the hip hop scene also clusters in Seoul as well. Now, to move on to Gwangju. Gwangju, the city, it's a population around 1.5 million. It is the former capital of South Jeolla province, and now it's a special metropolitan city. As many of you probably know, it was the site of the May 18th Gwangju Democratic Uprising in 1980, when the city rose up against Chun Doo-hwan's coup, and it was violently crushed. Hundreds were killed, thousands wounded, thousands imprisoned, tortured. And after democratization, the city really tried to rebrand itself as this cultural hub city of Asia, and so they put a lot of money into hosting the Gwangju Biennale, an annual art exhibition in the city, and the Asia Culture Center, this new massive cultural facility in the old downtown area. And Gwangju itself also has a rich musical history. Gwangju and the surrounding area birthed the Seokyeonje style of traditional pansori. A number of K-pop idols have come from the city, like Guhara, the late Guhara from Kara, Sungni from Big Bang, J-Hope from BTS. Seen indie musicians like Chang Bum-jun from Busker Busker out of there. And the Gwangju uprising also really influenced a lot of the subject matter and the Noreundong, the folk music scene surrounding the democracy movement in the 80s, and classical compositions. So hip hop in Gwangju didn't really emerge until the early 2000s, you know, just hip hop clubs and such, but the music scene itself is fairly young, and it didn't really emerge until the early 2010s. And it really coalesces around these two interconnected collectives, 062, 062 being the phone code, the area code for Gwangju. And it's this fashion brand cultural movement that was founded by DJ and producer 12 in 2011. And the idea, you know, why he started was to promote underground culture in Gwangju and kind of strengthen identity, local identity in the city. And it really became a rallying point for local hip hop artists and fans. We also have NOP Records, which was founded in 2014 by DJ Hung, who him and 12 were actually in a crew together back in the day. And he founded this label to give local artists an outlet to release and promote their music. But I mean, as I mentioned, you know, with the lack of popularity of these artists in their city, success was fleeting, and so they just kind of transitioned into becoming a crew in early 2019. Now I'm going to show some music, and I'll show how like Gwangju really features prominently in the imagery and lyrics of these artists. So I'll start with this track. And this is by Unusual. And this is actually a track that got me into the Gwangju hip hop scene.
Amos, are we supposed to hear a sound now?
Oh, you can't hear it?
No, perhaps what we could, I think. Yeah, so you could either share the screen with sound, or you drop the link to the video in the Dropbox, and then we just play it.
Oh, can I do it in the chat? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll do it in the chat. Hold on 1 second. I think I have to start. What can I? Oh, chat.
If it's just to watch a little bit of it, you can tell us like how much we should watch, like 20 seconds or 1
Oh,
minute.
sorry. 22 Barbara. Just sound in there.
Yeah, it's always tricky with these videos.
Yeah.
So we haven't. So how long should we? Perhaps I can use if you stop sharing.
Let me stop the share. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then I can.
Okay. We might not have time to go into other tracks, but.
So that's the right one, right?
Yeah.
So how much should we watch?
Watch like a minute. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Or maybe 45 seconds. Yeah.
Welcome to my album, my first EP. 집대성 요즘 래퍼들 앨범 거일 활성 밤에와 동시에 과거를 뒷걸음질 But I'm heading to the future 편협한 래퍼들 목에 힘 빼고 고개 숙여 내 미래지향적인 태도 꽉 막힌 사고로 이해 불가공 대들은 고개를 저어 1초
To here or more?
That's fine. I think that's like
we could also go on.
Okay, yeah. So we'll go back to the presentation. Oh,
Okay,
sorry, I gotta.
Then I stop sharing, and then you can share again.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Share screen. I don't know if we have time to. Yeah, I don't think we have time to go through all this with the technical difficulties. That my apologies. And I mean, Ugly Duck in J Park in the track Nowhere. I mean, Ugly Duck raps. 전라도 광주 촌놈이 어디까지 갈라나. Let's see how far this 촌놈 from Gwangju 전라도 goes. And 촌놈 is a sort of a derogatory term for people from the countryside, but people use it for also regional cities, people from regional cities. And as I mentioned before, nearly everybody in these two collectives has moved to Seoul. And they've kind of loosely organized around a tongue-in-cheek Kakao Talk group chat called Honam Hyangwoo. Honam Hyangwoo actually being this kind of organization in Seoul of middle-aged men from the Honam region where Gwangju is located, and they just hang out and network. So a little satire there. But they organized this event in 2019 on the anniversary of the May 18th Gwangju Democratic Uprising, called Honam Hyangwoo, in the Itaewon neighborhood in Seoul. And, you know, it was a way to kind of demonstrate, you know, the cultural happenings and the local identity of their city and them as artists. And if you look at the poster, this, you know, little character there is a Bobo, who's the mascot for Family Land, the big amusement park in Gwangju. And the event had backing from Cheonnam-ilbo, which is the local newspaper in Gwangju. And it was fairly successful. A lot of people came through from what I heard. I unfortunately couldn't attend. So we'll get to this. Why are hip hop artists in Gwangju continuously emigrating to Seoul? And what a lot of these artists were saying was that, you know, there's a lack of this, you know, cultural infrastructure and interest in hip hop and other subcultures in Gwangju. This despite the city, you know, investing all this money in these cultural facilities, it's not really supporting grassroots culture. And so, you know, they see that there's a lot of far more networking opportunities. There's a way larger market, way larger audience in Seoul. And so they go there, they feel that they can really find success there. The ceiling in Gwangju is so low. And I mean, I think this is demonstrated when I was going to shows and parties and such. I mean, the scene was very small, and when you go to shows, it's only about maybe at most 30 people, and it's usually other artists in the scene or, you know, friends of the artists, and it's very low ceiling there. And so, you know, without this local buzz, labels aren't really looking at artists from the provinces because they can't even really find them. You know, enough rappers are making the jump to Seoul where they can find them in Seoul. And I think this really hammers home the point, and you'll see pictured here is Ugly Duck and Buggy, and Ugly Duck is with AOMG, Buggy is a producer with Biz Major. And both of them had to make the jump to the scene in Seoul before they were discovered by their respective labels. I mean, Ugly Duck went as far as to say that he would not be discovered if he had stayed in Gwangju. So what's the issue? And obviously everybody has their different tastes, but we see that it's not really quality, in that, you know, there's a lot of support from collaboration with major artists in Korean hip hop and in Seoul. You know, these artists are invited to perform, well, before COVID, perform regularly at the major clubs in Seoul, hip hop clubs in Seoul. And they've received a lot of coverage from, you know, national hip hop outlets, you know, like Hip Hop LE, Hip Hop Player, Vizsla Mag, and also international music outlets like Unusual, whose video I just showed you was in High Snobiety, top 10 emerging Korean rappers to watch out for. And so what these artists were saying was, you know, Gwangju youth are very sensitive to media trends emanating. It's not a media trend in Seoul, it's not going to end up in Gwangju. And so, you know, everybody's eyes are looking towards Seoul, and they're just kind of looking down on your local culture scene. Again, a couple quotes from the artists I interviewed. And, you know, a lot of the artists pointed to the lack of music market in Gwangju, the weak economy, you know, there, especially in comparison to Sudokwon, the Seoul capital area. And I mean, the weak cultural scene compared to Seoul. I mean, 12E, who again is kind of this godfather figure in the scene, he goes as far as to tell local artists, like, you have to go to Sudokwon. You have to focus there because everybody's eyes are there. And these sentiments really echo several scholars, you know, Korean scholars' work on hypercentralization of the country and Seoul and regional inequalities. I'm going to share with you some fun facts that, and you know, I owe a lot to Professor Kang Jung-man at Cheongbuk National University, his work on regionalism, regional inequalities. I mean, fun facts: all the companies are based in Seoul. 2/3 of Korea's GDP is produced in Seoul. All the political powers in Seoul. All the media outlets are in Seoul. All the money going to culture from private foundations is going to things in the capital area. The top universities, the Sky University, Seoul National University, Korea University, Yonsei universities, are all in Seoul. And I think Ugly Duck kind of used this term called, he coined it, co-rail hip hop. And he said, and it's not just for hip hop, but you know, there's this kind of romanticized vision that people in the provinces have of making the jump to Seoul, to, you know, finally get that opportunity, find success that they can't find in their own city, and hopping on the train, hopping on the co-rail to go to Seoul. And so another interesting quote came from Wholesome. He's a producer and DJ. And he said that, you know, if people have more free time, people would have more interest in the culture. They would, you know, have more time to consume, to discover these things, and these subcultures would become larger. I think his observation really echoes that of the cultural anthropologist Cho Hae-jong, who in her study of a youth center in Seoul, supported by City Hall, she noticed this creative renaissance amongst Korean youth in the early 90s and mid 90s, and that this creative renaissance was completely stifled by the IMF crisis, which, I mean, nearly destroyed the Korean economy. The middle class shrunk. A lot of the labor reforms there created a very irregular, unstable labor market. And so because of these anxieties and worries, I mean, parents started investing a lot in education. And so you see that Korean youth are really spending a lot of time. School is finished, you go to cram school, you study long hours there, you want to get into a prestigious university, which, you know, their parents, them and their parents see as, you know, the best way of landing that good, the few good, stable jobs there are in the Korean labor market. And so this kind of brings me into kind of the phenomenon of cultural deterritorialization as defined by the sociologist Gil Manuel Hernandez y Martí, in which he says it's a phenomenon in which the growing presence of social forms of contact and involvement which go beyond the limits of the specific territory results in the displacement of local social, political, or cultural practices by those of remote origin, making it more difficult to maintain a stable sense of local cultural identity. And we really see that in Gwangju and in other provincial localities, in that there's so few opportunities, so little free time, and from a young age, they're really imbued with this mentality that you have to move to Seoul in order to find success. They're spending long hours, you know, realizing this goal. And in the little free time they have, they're largely consuming media from Seoul. And so they become very detached, you know, culturally detached from their own locality. And so if somebody's coming out and saying, oh, yo, we're repping Gwangju, we're repping Daegu, we're repping Busan, they either ignore it or thinking, what are you doing? And so they're not affording their support to these scenes. They don't see it as worth their time. And so what these artists in Gwangju and other provincial localities are forced to do is, you know, make that move to Seoul. And if they get big in Seoul, then they can get big back in their own locality. It's a very weird dynamic. And in this picture, in terms of, that's the police visiting us when we held a concert on a rooftop in 2017. And I had to explain to them what was happening because I threw it. And so in conclusion, I mean, we see that, you know, Seoul's hegemony over the foundations of the country makes it unlikely that other localities outside its periphery can build a counterbalance of economic, cultural, political, or social influence in Korea. And you can also see that asserting one's local identity within a wider cultural landscape can be seen as a sort of minor act of resistance in the face of Seoul's media and cultural hegemony. And I'll stop there. That's the bibliography. And yeah, so